I didn't even bother to take off his shoes when he walked through the front door. That was the kind of man Adrian Mercer had become. Someone who walked through his own home like it was a hotel lobby. He'd spent the night at the Fairmont, tangled in silk sheets with a woman who laughed at all his jokes and never once asked him why he came home smelling like someone else. He poured himself a glass of water in the kitchen, loosened his tie, and started toward the hallway. Then he stopped. The house was quiet in a way that houses aren't supposed to be quiet when there's a 4-month-old baby inside. He walked to the nursery and pushed open the door. The crib was gone. The changing table was gone. The little mobile with the wooden stars that played a lullaby he'd never once listened to. Gone. The walls were bare. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and something else he couldn't name. Something final. On the kitchen counter, catching the morning light, like it was placed there on purpose, and it was, sat Naomi's wedding ring. If that were you standing in that empty nursery, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please take a second to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, and I think it will, give it a like. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to the beginning of the day that destroyed everything Adrian Mercer thought he had built. The morning Adrian Mercer's life fell apart started the same way every other morning had for the past 6 months, with a lie he'd told so many times it had stopped feeling like one. He woke up in room 412 of the Fairmont, Seattle at 7:43 in the morning, reached across the mattress, and felt the warmth of a body that was not his wife's. Vanessa, 29 years old, marketing consultant, laughed like a television commercial, bright, practiced, and slightly too loud. She was already half awake, scrolling through her phone with one hand, the other arm tucked beneath her cheek, and she looked the way women in movies looked in the morning, which was not how real people looked, but Adrian had stopped noticing the difference. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. "I'm leaving," he said. She didn't argue. That was one of the things he liked about her. She never argued about the things that mattered. He showered, dressed, and looked at himself in the bathroom mirror the way men do when they're trying to convince themselves of something. 51 years old, still sharp around the jaw, still wearing the right watch, still the kind of man who got good tables at restaurants without asking twice. He straightened his tie and decided he looked fine. He did not think about Naomi. He told himself that was fine too. The drive back across town took 22 minutes. Adrian had made it so many times he barely had to think. He told Naomi he was at a conference in Portland, one of those real estate investment summits with bad coffee and worse panel discussions that she'd long ago stopped asking to attend. She'd believed him without pushing back, the way she'd started believing most of what he said lately, which was less about trust and more about exhaustion. A woman caring for a 4-month-old alone doesn't have the energy left to investigate her husband's lies. Adrian knew this. He counted on it. He pulled into the driveway at 8:17 and turned off the engine. The house was a 7,000-square-foot craftsman on a wooded lot in Laurelhurst, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors didn't wave to each other but did notice everything. He'd bought it 3 years ago as a statement, a declaration. This is what I am worth. He grabbed his overnight bag from the back seat, walked up the front steps, and pushed the key into the lock. The house was quiet. Not the quiet of a sleeping baby. That particular quiet has a texture to it, a held breath quality that parents learn to read fast. This was different. This was the quiet of absence. He dropped his bag in the hallway. "Naomi?" Nothing. He walked toward the kitchen first, out of habit. He was going to pour a coffee, maybe sit down at the island for 5 minutes before whatever version of mourning he was required to perform for his family began. His eye caught something on the counter, and his brain registered it before his conscious mind did, the way a driver sees a deer in the road a half-second before their foot hits the brake. The ring. He picked it up. It was a simple platinum band with a single diamond. He'd let her choose it herself, which at the time he'd told people was romantic, but was actually just convenient. He turned it over in his fingers. The inside was engraved. AM plus NM, always. His idea. He'd forgotten that until this moment. He set it back down on the counter, very carefully, the way you set something down when some part of you already knows what it means and you are not ready to know it yet. He walked to the nursery. He stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. The room was empty. Not messy empty, not rearranged empty. Completely empty. The crib gone. The dresser gone. The little white bookshelf with the board books he'd never read. The baby monitor on the windowsill. The small wicker basket of diapers and wipes that had lived next to the changing table. Gone. Every item that said a child lives here had been removed with a thoroughness that felt deliberate. Surgical. The walls still had the pale yellow paint they'd chosen, Naomi had chosen, before Noah was born. The curtains were still there, thin white ones with small stars on them. But everything else was gone. Adrian stood there and felt something he almost never felt. Fear. He called Naomi's cell phone 4 times in the next 3 minutes. Each call went immediately to voicemail. Her voice on the recording sounded so normal, he wanted to scream at it. "You've reached Naomi Mercer. I'm unavailable right now." He hung up before the beep every time. He checked their joint checking account on his phone. Then he checked it again because the number he was seeing didn't make sense. $43.17. He refreshed the screen. The number didn't change. He went to their savings account. $11.04. He sat down on the kitchen floor. He sat there for a full minute. Adrian Mercer, who had not sat on a floor since he was probably 7 years old, sat on his expensive Spanish tile and stared at his phone and tried to understand what was happening to him. $212,000. Gone. Transferred out over the past several weeks in careful, incremental amounts, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic bank alert. He would learn all of this later. Right now, all he could see was the number on the screen. He got up off the floor. He called his lawyer first. Then he called the police. Then he called his brother Marcus, who picked up on the second ring and said, "Adrian, slow down. I can't understand you 3 times," before Adrian finally managed to form complete sentences. "She took Noah," Adrian said. "She took him and left." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "When?" "I don't know. Last night. While I was—" He stopped. "While I was away." "Portland," Marcus said, and the flatness in his voice told Adrian that Marcus had never believed Portland. "I need you to come over." "I'm on my way," Marcus said. "Don't talk to anyone else until I get there." 2 uniformed officers arrived before Marcus did. They were younger than Adrian expected, both of them with the carefully neutral expressions that people practice when they're trained to listen without reacting. They walked through the house. They took notes. One of them asked Adrian when he'd last seen his wife and son. "Yesterday morning," Adrian said, "before I left for a conference." "And where was that conference?" "Portland. The Marriott downtown. I can give you the name of the event coordinator." The officer wrote this down. Adrian watched the pen move across the notepad, and something in his chest went tight. "Mr. Mercer," the other officer said, "did your wife have any family she might have traveled to? Friends out of state?" "She has a sister in Phoenix. They don't talk much." He paused. "Her college roommate, maybe. I don't know her last name." The officer looked up. "You don't know her friend's last name?" "We've been busy," Adrian said. "We had a newborn." The word we felt wrong as soon as he said it. Marcus arrived at 9:45 and immediately began doing what Marcus always did in a crisis, which was to assess the room and figure out who was performing competence and who actually had it. He shook hands with both officers, asked 3 precise questions, and then followed Adrian into the living room while the police continued their walkthrough. "Tell me the truth," Marcus said, keeping his voice low. "I already told you." "Adrian." Marcus had a look he'd been giving his brother since they were children. "It didn't mean I'm judging you. It meant I already know, so stop." Adrian sat down on the couch. "Vanessa," he said. "How long?" 6 months. Marcus observed this without visible reaction, which was worse than if he'd reacted. "Does Naomi know?" I don't think she knows." "You don't think?" "She didn't say anything. She seemed fine, tired. The baby, she was dealing with the baby and she was—" He stopped. He was listing the symptoms of a woman being left alone to drown while he stood on the shore, and he was doing it in a tone that suggested he found this reasonable. Marcus stood up and walked to the window. "She knew, Adrian. You don't know that. Women always know." He turned around. "The question is what she did with knowing it." What she had done with knowing it, they would eventually piece together, was this. Naomi Reeves Mercer, who had graduated top of her class from Georgetown Law and then given up a career at a firm downtown to support Adrian's business when they married, had spent approximately 4 months building an exit so precise and so quiet that it moved through the house like weather. She had opened a separate bank account 11 weeks before she left. She had consulted with a family law attorney in another state. They would later discover a firm in Denver, 2 months before the disappearance. She had transferred small amounts of money from the joint accounts every week, amounts small enough to miss in the daily blur of automatic payments and business expenses that flowed through their finances. She had packed, not all at once, but gradually, a few things every week, placed into bags that she stored somewhere Adrian never looked, which turned out to be the back of the garage behind the camping equipment they'd bought before Noah was born and never once used. She had documented everything. This was the part that would matter most, the part no one saw coming, not Adrian, not Marcus, not the 2 young officers writing in their notepads. Naomi had been keeping a record. Dates. Times. Hotel charges on the credit card statements she photographed on her phone before Adrian deleted the email notifications. Text messages she'd found on a phone he thought he'd hidden. Voicemails. A recording. She'd recorded it on her laptop while he was in the kitchen. Through the baby monitor he didn't know still transmitted to the one in their bedroom. A recording of a phone call Adrian had with Vanessa during which he had said, laughing, that he wished Naomi would just take the kid and disappear. He had said that. He couldn't remember saying it, but he had said it. By noon, the house felt like a place something had died in. The officers were gone. Marcus had made coffee that no one was drinking. Adrian's lawyer, a methodical man named Gerald Cho, was on his way over and had already begun texting questions and bullet points. Adrian sat at the kitchen island with his phone and his cold coffee and his wife's wedding ring still sitting on the counter where he'd left it because he couldn't decide what to do with it, and so he'd done nothing. A detective named Salinas called at 12:30. Her voice was the careful, even voice of someone who spent all day delivering information to people in the worst moments of their lives and had learned that the most useful thing she could do was be clear. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you to be honest with me about your whereabouts last night. I told the officers, Portland. We called the Marriott. There's no record of a reservation under your name or your company's name." A pause. "There was no real estate conference registered in Portland this weekend." The kitchen went very still. "Mr. Mercer?" He closed his eyes. "I was at the Fairmont," he said. "Here in Seattle." "With someone?" "Yes." "We're going to need her name." He gave it. He could hear Detective Salinas writing it down. Then she said the thing that pulled the floor out from under him. "Mr. Mercer, your wife filed for divorce this morning, in Colorado. Her attorney reached out to our department approximately 2 hours ago. She has Noah with her, and she's represented." A beat. "She's not missing. She left." He knew that. He had known it from the moment he saw the empty nursery. But hearing it stated plainly, in a detective's measured voice, turned knowing into something much heavier. "She took my son," he said. "She's his mother," Detective Salinas said. "And right now, the law looks at this differently than you might expect." Another pause. "Careful. I'd really recommend you speak with your attorney before taking any other steps." He hung up and sat very still for a long moment. Then he looked at Naomi's ring on the counter. Then he looked at his phone. Then he called Vanessa. She answered on the 3rd ring, and he could hear in the background the sounds of her normal Saturday. Music, the clink of a coffee cup, the uncomplicated noise of a life with no children in it. He asked her to come over. She went quiet for a moment and then said carefully, "Adrian, is everything okay?" And he said, "No," which was the most honest thing he'd said in 6 months. When Gerald Cho arrived at 1 in the afternoon, he sat across from Adrian at the dining room table, opened his legal pad, and said, "Before we discuss strategy, I need you to understand something." "Okay," Adrian said. "Whatever you are feeling right now, betrayed, angry, blindsided, you need to set it aside, completely. Because the moment you act on emotion instead of strategy, you lose." He looked at Adrian steadily over his reading glasses. "And I'm going to tell you something else. Based on what you've described, the documentation she appears to have, the separate legal filing, the financial transfers, your wife was not acting impulsively. She planned this, which means she is not running scared. She is not fragile. She is somebody who has been building a case against you for months." Adrian looked at his hands on the table. How is that legal? She took my son across. She is his primary caregiver, Gerald said, without emotion. She has been since birth. You've been away, frequently, since Noah was born. We need to be prepared for that narrative, because her attorneys will use it. I've been working. I provide financially, yes. Courts care about physical presence, too. Gerald set down his pen. Adrian, when is Noah's birthday? The question landed oddly. March. What date? He opened his mouth, closed it. The 14th? He heard the question mark in his own voice, and it disgusted him. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. He didn't write anything down. What's his middle name? Gerald asked. And Adrian Mercer, who had negotiated $40 million real estate deals, who had never once walked into a room and not known exactly what he was worth, sat at his own dining room table and could not answer the question. The silence lasted a long time. When Adrian finally looked up, Gerald was still watching him. Not with judgment. With something that was somehow worse. With pity. We have a lot of work to do, Gerald said quietly, and he picked up his pen. Gerald Cho left at 3:15, and the house felt smaller after he was gone. Adrian sat at the dining room table for a long time without moving. The legal pad Gerald had left behind had 12 lines of notes on it, mostly questions, mostly things Adrian hadn't been able to answer. Noah's pediatrician's name, the name of the woman who had helped Naomi during the postpartum weeks, whether Adrian had ever attended a single one of Noah's checkups. He hadn't, not one. He knew this the way you know something you've been avoiding, not like a surprise, but like a bill you stopped opening because you already knew the number inside was bad. He picked up his phone and called Vanessa again. She answered faster this time. I've been waiting, she said. There was something different in her voice, a carefulness that hadn't been there this morning. She'd had time to think. I need you to come over, he said. Adrian. A pause. What exactly happened? My wife left. She took Noah. He heard how flat it sounded. She cleaned out our accounts. She filed for divorce in Colorado. Vanessa was quiet long enough that he pulled the phone away from his ear to check if the call had dropped. She filed in Colorado, she finally said. She planned it, months of planning. He stood up and walked toward the window. The backyard was empty. The small wooden playset he'd had installed in the spring, because a contractor had suggested it, and Adrian had approved it without thinking, without picturing a child actually using it, sat in the middle of the lawn. I need someone here right now, Vanessa. I can't. He stopped himself. The sentence had been going somewhere he didn't want it to go. I'll come, she said. But her voice had a shape to it now that he didn't recognize. Not warmth. Something more like calculation. Give me an hour? She arrived in 50 minutes. He watched her walk up the front path from the window. The same confident stride, the same way she carried herself like the whole world was a room she'd just entered. But when she came inside and looked at the house, really looked at it, the family photos on the walls, the small pair of baby shoes on the hallway shelf, Naomi's reading glasses left on the side table like she'd just stepped out to get coffee. Something shifted in Vanessa's face. She stood in the middle of the living room and said, "This is the first time I've been inside your house." It was true. They'd always met at the Fairmont, or occasionally at her apartment. He told himself it was practical. It hadn't felt like cowardice until now. I know, he said. She looked at the family photos. Adrian and Naomi at their wedding, 7 years ago. Naomi huge and beaming at what must have been the baby shower. Adrian wasn't in that one. A photo of the three of them at the hospital, Noah, an hour old. Naomi's face pale and shocked, and completely open in the way faces are when a person has just been through something their body will never entirely forgive. She looks kind, Vanessa said. Not cruelly, just as an observation. She is, Adrian said. He hadn't meant to say it. Vanessa turned and looked at him. Why are you calling me, Adrian? What exactly do you need from me right now? He didn't have a good answer. He'd called her because she was the person he talked to. He'd called her because the house was silent and silence had become unbearable. He'd called her because in the 6 months they'd been together, he had told her more about his daily life than he'd told Naomi in 2 years, and he hadn't once stopped to examine what that meant. I don't know, he said. She sat down on the couch, looked at him. The police are going to talk to me. I know. They're going to ask me about Portland. I know that too. I told you that story was going to fall apart, she said, and there was no satisfaction in it, just the clean edge of someone stating a fact they'd already said out loud once before. You did, he admitted. She folded her hands in her lap. Adrian, I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to not react for at least 30 seconds before you respond. She looked at him steadily. I think you need to focus on your son right now, not on me, not on us, on Noah. He started to say something. She held up one hand. 30 seconds, she said. He sat with it. The word Noah in her voice sounded strange to him, not because she'd said it wrong, but because she'd said it more gently than he would have expected, and that gentleness pressed on something inside his chest that had been going numb for months. She is not going to let this be easy, Vanessa said. And she shouldn't. You were not. She stopped, reconsidered, started again. What we were doing, what I was doing, I didn't think about him. She glanced at the hospital photo. I thought about you not being happy. I thought about Naomi in an abstract sort of way, the way you think about someone you've never met. But I didn't think about that baby. Don't, Adrian said. I'm not trying to make you feel worse. It's working anyway. She almost smiled. Almost. I know. She stood up. I'm going to go home, and you're going to call your lawyer and do whatever he tells you to do. She picked up her bag. And Adrian, when the detective calls me, I'm going to tell the truth. I need you to know that. I know, he said. Tell them whatever you need to. She walked toward the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think she was very brave. Then she left. And Adrian stood in his living room, surrounded by photographs of a life he'd been running from, and understood for the first time that Vanessa was not going to be his way through this. There was no way through this. There was only forward. Detective Salinas called again at 4:50. Her voice was the same, measured, careful, the voice of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had smoothed out all the sharp edges in her tone. We've confirmed your wife and son are safe, she said. They're not in any danger. I want to be clear about that. Where are they? I'm not able to share that at this time. She took my son across state lines, Mr. Mercer. She waited for him to stop. Her attorney filed a temporary custody order in Colorado this morning. It was granted at 2:15 this afternoon. A beat. Legally, you are not permitted to remove Noah from her custody at this time. Any attempt to do so would be, I understand what it would be, he said. I need to hear that you understand. I understand, he said, through something that had closed in his throat. There will be a hearing scheduled. Your attorney will be notified. She paused. Mr. Mercer, I spoke with your wife's attorney this afternoon. I want you to know. She documented a great deal. I'd strongly encourage you to be very honest with your own legal team about the full picture. He already knew what the full picture looked like. He just hadn't had to look directly at it yet. Marcus came back at 6 with takeout food that neither of them ate and sat across from Adrian in the kitchen with the untouched containers between them and the wedding ring still on the counter. You need to eat something, Marcus said. I need to find them. Gerald already told you. I know what Gerald told me. Adrian pushed back from the island. She is somewhere with my son and I don't know where and I can't. He stopped, put both hands flat on the counter. I don't even know who she called. I don't know who helped her. I don't know her doctor's name. I don't know her therapist's name. I don't know the name of the woman who came over twice a week to help her after Noah was born because I was gone. His voice had dropped to something rough and unrecognizable. I don't know anything about her life. Marcus was quiet. 4 months, Adrian said. Noah is 4 months old and I barely know him. Then fix that, Marcus said. Simply. No anger in it. Just the blunt geometry of a man who had watched his brother spend years choosing the wrong things and had run out of delicate ways to say so. You think I can fix this? I think you can try. Marcus finally unwrapped one of the food containers, pushed it toward Adrian. But not tonight. Tonight you eat something. You call Gerald. You don't call Vanessa again. He looked up. And you stop treating this like something that was done to you. Adrian stared at him. She didn't destroy your life, Adrian. You built the conditions. She just stopped pretending they were livable. He shrugged, the way Marcus always shrugged when he said things that landed like bricks, like he was apologizing for the accuracy. That's different. Adrian picked up a fork, put it down, picked it up again, ate something he couldn't taste, and tried to figure out how a man who had survived every negotiation, every hostile bid, every market collapse he'd ever walked into, had somehow lost the most important thing he owned without ever noticing it slipping. Vanessa called Detective Salinas the following morning. Adrian didn't know exactly what she said. He wasn't there. And Vanessa didn't call him after to report back. And he didn't ask. But Gerald called him at 11:15 on Sunday morning, and his voice had shifted into the particular register it used when things had changed significantly. Her name and statement are now part of the record, Gerald said. She corroborated the hotel. She confirmed your relationship and the duration. She also mentioned a pause. Careful. She mentioned a phone call. A conversation she had with you approximately 8 weeks ago in which you made comments about your wife. Adrian went still. What kind of comments, he asked, even though something low in his stomach already knew. She says you told her that you wished Naomi would take the baby and leave so you could stop pretending. A pause. Were those your words? He pressed his fingers against his eyes. He was in the kitchen again. He kept ending up in the kitchen, as if some part of him believed that if he stood in the same spot long enough, the ring would disappear from the counter and the whole morning would unhappen. I don't remember saying that exactly, but something like it. It was frustration. Vanessa and I talk like that. Adrian. Gerald's voice had its no more runway quality. Naomi's legal team has a recording. The kitchen went absolutely silent. What? He said. A recording. Made through the baby monitor in your bedroom. They're claiming approximately 4 minutes of audio from a phone call, approximately 8 weeks ago. The transcript has already been submitted as part of her preliminary filing. He sat down on the kitchen floor again. Same spot, same tile. Different morning, same floor. You can do that? You can just... She was in the home. The recording was made in a shared space. We'll challenge the admissibility, but... Gerald stopped. Adrian, I need you to understand what this filing looks like. The financial documentation, the witness statement from Vanessa, the recording, the parenting record, or the absence of one. She is not filing for a fair settlement. She is filing for everything. He sat there on his cold kitchen floor and looked at the cabinet beneath the sink. What does everything mean? He asked. Primary custody, child support, spousal maintenance, the house, potentially. A pause. Her attorney is very good. How good? She clerked for a federal judge. She's been practicing family law for 15 years. She's won cases that should not have been winnable. Another pause. She took Naomi's case pro bono. Pro bono, Adrian repeated. Why would she do that? Because cases like this one are the kind that make careers, Gerald said. And there was something in his voice, not admiration exactly, but a kind of reluctant professional recognition. And because your wife apparently knew exactly who to call. The week that followed had a kind of grinding, mechanical quality. A series of phone calls and legal documents and cold cups of coffee, and nights where Adrian lay in the dark of the bedroom and listened to the silence where a baby monitor should have been. He hired a private investigator named Daryl Okafor, a former sheriff's deputy from Tacoma, who drove a 10-year-old Volvo and billed $300 an hour, and said very little that wasn't directly relevant to what you were paying him to find. I can locate them, Daryl told him, in the small, cluttered office above a dry cleaner on 3rd Avenue. It'll take some time. She's not a professional at disappearing, but someone helped her, and that someone knew what they were doing. How long? Adrian asked. 2 weeks, maybe less if she makes contact with anyone traceable. Daryl folded his hands on the desk. He was a big, quiet man with the kind of face that had stopped being expressive years ago. Mr. Mercer, I've done this a lot. Can I say something? Go ahead. Whatever you're planning to do when I find them, think about it very carefully before you do it. He looked at Adrian without blinking. Because the thing most men in your position want to do is the thing that will guarantee they lose. I just want to see my son. I know, Daryl said. That's what they all say. He picked up his pen. And some of them even mean it. Gerald filed emergency motions. Naomi's attorney, a woman named Patricia Wren, whose name Gerald said with an involuntary grimace every single time, filed counter motions. The court date for the initial hearing was set for 6 weeks out. 6 weeks felt like a prison sentence. On the 9th day, Marcus showed up at the house unannounced with his wife, Diane, who immediately began doing things that needed doing. Running laundry, clearing out the food that had gone bad in the refrigerator, making actual meals on the stove rather than pointing at takeout containers. Diane had never particularly liked Adrian, and she made no effort to pretend otherwise. But she was efficient and relentless, and that morning Adrian found her competence more comforting than anything else anyone had offered him. "You look terrible," she told him, over scrambled eggs she'd made from scratch. "I know," he said. "When did you last sleep?" "I don't know." She put a plate in front of him, sat down across from him. She'd known Adrian for 11 years, and they'd maybe had 20 real conversations in all that time, and this was the first one where she looked at him like she was actually trying to see him. "She called me," Diane said. He looked up fast. "Before she left," Diane said. "About 3 weeks before. She called to ask about Marcus's cousin, the one who went through the divorce a couple years ago. She wanted to know who he'd used." Diane wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I told her. I didn't know then what she was planning." A pause. "But I think I suspected." "You didn't tell me," Adrian said. "No," Diane said. "I didn't." The words sat there between them on the table, simple and immovable. She hadn't told him. She had answered a question from a woman she'd watched go quiet and small over the past several months, a woman she'd watched carry a baby alone through 2 family dinners while her husband talked about business acquisitions, and she had answered the question and not said a word to Adrian. "Would you?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. "Would I what?" "If you were her, would you have done what she did?" Diane was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a car went by. A bird hit one note somewhere in the backyard. The scrambled eggs on his plate steamed gently, and he didn't touch them. "Yes," Diane said. "I think I would have." On the 11th day, Daryl Okafor called. "I found them," he said. Adrian gripped the phone. "Where?" "Western Colorado, small town outside Glenwood Springs. She's staying at a property registered to a woman named Ellen Briggs. I'm checking, but I believe Briggs was a friend from college, possibly the roommate." He paused. "They're at a cabin, private road. There's a county sheriff who patrols the area regularly. I think she's made some arrangement there, notified them, something like that. She's not hiding carelessly." "Is Noah okay?" "From what I can observe, yes, they appear to be doing fine." Daryl's voice had that same careful neutrality. "Mr. Mercer, I want to reiterate what I said in my office. I've done my job. What you do with this information is your decision, but I'm advising you, as clearly as I can, not to go there." "I hear you," Adrian said. He was already looking up flights to Denver. Gerald called him 12 minutes after that, as if the universe had organized the timing to make the point as sharp as possible. "The restraining order went through," Gerald said, "effective immediately. You are not to approach within 100 yards of your wife or your son until the custody hearing." A pause. "Adrian, this is serious. Violating this order does not just hurt your custody case. It is a criminal matter." "I understand," Adrian said. "Do you?" Gerald asked. And his voice had something in it, not anger, not professionalism, but something closer to genuine concern. The voice of a man who had watched enough clients make this exact mistake to know the look of someone standing at that edge. "Because I need you to understand completely. If you get on a plane, if you drive to wherever she is, if you come within any distance of that cabin, you will lose Noah. Not in a 'this makes it harder' way. In a 'this is effectively over' way." Adrian stood at his bedroom window, the backyard, the playset. "She drove away," he said, mostly to himself. "What?" "I've been picturing it," he said. "Her putting him in the car seat, driving away." He pressed his fingers against the glass. "I don't even know what he looks like now. He was 4 months old. They change fast, I know they change fast, and I don't know what his face looks like right now." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Then be there," Gerald said quietly, "when you're allowed to be. Make the hearing the moment everything changes. That's the only move you have." Another pause. "Don't throw that away for one conversation she won't let you have." Adrian stared at the playset in the yard. He didn't close his laptop. He didn't cancel the search he'd started on the airline site, but he sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 11 days, He put his face in his hands and stopped moving. He sat there for a long time. Then he picked up his phone, not to call Vanessa, not to call the airline, not to call Daryl, but to do something he hadn't done once in the 11 days since he'd found the empty nursery. Since he'd found the ring on the counter, since he'd sat on the kitchen floor and stared at a bank balance that told him exactly how precisely his wife had dismantled the financial foundation he'd believed made him untouchable. He opened his photo gallery. He scrolled back to March. And there was Noah, a few hours old, wrapped in a striped hospital blanket, eyes squeezed shut, face creased and red, and unfinished the way newborn faces are, still wearing the expression of someone who had just arrived somewhere unexpected. Naomi's hand, in the corner of the frame, curved around the baby's head. Adrian stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't know his son's middle name. He hadn't known it when Gerald asked, and he still didn't know it now, and the not knowing sat in the middle of his chest like something had been removed without his permission, which was not quite right. More like something had never been put there in the first place, because he had been somewhere else. He had always been somewhere else. He closed the photo, set the phone face down on the mattress, and made the only decision that mattered. He booked the flight. Not because Gerald was wrong. Gerald was completely right, and Adrian knew it with the clarity of a man who had built an entire career on reading a room correctly. He booked the flight because there is a difference between the thing that is strategically correct and the thing that your body has already decided it is going to do. And he had hit the boundary between those two things, and he had crossed it. He booked the flight, and then he sat on the edge of the bed in the house that suddenly felt like a museum of a life. He'd been too busy to actually live, and he waited for morning, and he did not sleep. The flight to Denver left at 6:40 in the morning. Adrian was at the gate by 5:15, carrying nothing but a carry-on bag he'd packed in the dark, without thinking too hard about what went inside it. A change of clothes, his phone charger, his wallet. The small things a man grabs when he is operating on instinct rather than reason. He bought a black coffee at the terminal, and stood at the window watching the ground crew move beneath the belly of the plane and tried to construct some version of what he was going to say when he got there. He couldn't construct anything. Every sentence he built fell apart before it finished. He boarded anyway. The flight was 2 hours and 16 minutes. He spent the first hour staring at the tray table and the second hour staring at the photo of Noah on his phone. The hospital photo, the only one he could find where it was just the two of them, where Naomi's hand wasn't in frame. He'd taken it himself, that photo. He remembered that much. The nurse had handed Noah to him for approximately 4 minutes while Naomi was being seen to, and he'd held the baby the way you hold something you're afraid of breaking, both arms rigid, and he'd taken the photo because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. Then the nurse had come back and he'd handed Noah over with something that felt uncomfortably like relief. He was not proud of that memory. He looked at Noah's face in the photo and tried to calculate what 4 months did to a face that small. He didn't know enough about babies to know. That was its own particular kind of shame. The plane landed at 8:58. He rented a car at the counter using a card Gerald didn't know about. Not because he'd planned it that way, but because it was the first card he'd pulled from his wallet, and some part of him understood that the less of a paper trail this had, the less Gerald would be able to say later. He drove west out of Denver on I-770 with the mountains coming up in front of him, and Daryl Okafor's directions loaded into his phone and the restraining order sitting in his jacket pocket like something radioactive that he'd chosen to carry anyway. The drive to Glenwood Springs took 2.5 hours. The landscape changed as he went, the flat eastern sprawl giving way to foothills, then canyon walls, the Colorado River running alongside the highway in a cold, muddy rush. The whole country narrowing and deepening around him as if the geography itself was trying to make a point about where he was headed and what waited at the end of it. He stopped once, outside Vail, at a gas station where a woman was loading a car seat into the back of an SUV while a toddler stood next to her, holding onto her jacket with one fist. Adrian sat in the parked rental car and watched this for longer than he should have. The woman said something to the child. He couldn't hear it through the glass, and the child laughed. She buckled the car seat with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it so many times it had become part of her body. Then she picked up the child and said something else, and the child laughed again. Adrian drove away from the gas station with his jaw locked and both hands tight on the wheel. He reached Glenwood Springs at 11:40 and turned off the highway onto the county road Daryl had marked on the map. Private road, Daryl had said. Not gated, but marked. The road was unpaved and it wound up through pine trees for about a mile and a half before it opened onto a small property with a low cabin set back from a clearing. A gray Subaru was parked beside the cabin. There was a tire swing in one of the pine trees. Someone had put a small row of potted herbs on the porch railing. Adrian parked at the edge of the clearing and turned off the engine. He sat there for a while. Through the windshield, the cabin looked like a place where someone had been trying to make the best of something. Not temporary, exactly. There were small domestic gestures everywhere, the kind that means someone is trying to create normalcy rather than just endure. The herbs on the railing. A pair of small boots by the front door, too big for Noah, which meant they were Naomi's, or Ellen's, or whoever else was here. A clothesline off to the side with laundry hanging in the mountain air. He got out of the car. The air was cold and thin and smelled like pine resin and something else, wood smoke maybe, and it hit him with the particular clarity of high-altitude air that makes everything feel more exposed. He took 4 steps across the clearing toward the cabin. The front door opened. Not Naomi. A woman he didn't recognize, tall, dark hair pulled back, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, with the look of someone who had been watching the road for exactly this kind of car and had been prepared for it. She stepped onto the porch and stood there without saying anything, which was somehow more intimidating than if she'd shouted. "You must be Ellen," Adrian said. "You need to go back to your car," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Right now. I just need to see—" "I know what you need." She hadn't moved from the porch steps. "There's a deputy who patrols this road every 2 hours. He was here 40 minutes ago. You want to be gone before he comes back." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking." "Naomi," Adrian said past her toward the closed cabin door. "Naomi, I know you're in there. I just need 5 minutes." Ellen moved down 1 step. "If you call her name again, I'm calling the sheriff right now. Not in 2 hours. Right now." He stopped. Behind Ellen, inside the cabin, he heard something. A small sound. Not words. Just a sound. High and brief and quiet. The kind of sound a baby makes when something in the room changes and they register it without knowing why. The kind of sound he had not heard in 11 days and had not realized until this exact moment standing in a pine clearing in western Colorado, violating a court order. How much he had been hearing it in his sleep. The front door opened behind Ellen. Naomi stood in the doorway. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt and her hair was down and she looked like someone who had been sleeping, mostly, and eating, probably, and spending her days in this cabin in these mountains, allowing herself to simply exist without performing anything for anyone. She looked more like herself than she had in 2 years. He noticed that immediately, and it did something to him that he hadn't expected. Not anger, not relief, but something that sat right in between them and had no clean name. She was holding Noah. Noah was wearing a pale blue outfit with small white buttons. He was bigger than Adrian remembered. His face had filled out, lost the bruised urgency of the newborn photographs, and settled into something that was still unfinished but was beginning to suggest a person. He was awake. His eyes, dark, unfocused at this distance, the way infant eyes still are, moved around the clearing without landing on anything in particular. Adrian looked at his son for a long moment without speaking. Noah did not look back. Noah was 4 months old, and the clearing was full of new light and cold air and the smell of pine trees, and he was occupied with all of that. He had no idea who the man standing in the clearing was. That was the part that broke something open. Naomi looked at Adrian across the 20 feet of pine-needled ground between them. She looked at him the way you look at something you have already made peace with, which is different from forgiveness and different from anger, and is somehow harder than both. Her expression did not change. She shifted Noah slightly on her hip, an automatic gesture, the kind that means a person has been doing this for months, and the child's weight has become part of their body's understanding of itself. She did not speak. Adrian opened his mouth, and that was when he heard the second vehicle. A county sheriff's cruiser came up the private road slowly, no lights, no siren, just the crunch of tires on gravel and the shape of official presence moving through the pine trees. It pulled into the clearing and stopped, and a deputy got out who was younger than Adrian had expected and had the particular unhurried manner of someone who had been briefed. "Sir," the deputy said, "I'm going to need to see some identification." Adrian did not look away from Naomi. Naomi did not look away from Adrian. Between them, Noah made a small sound and turned his face into his mother's shoulder. "Sir?" the deputy said again, with slightly more weight in it. Adrian reached slowly into his jacket and produced his wallet. The deputy took his license, walked back to the cruiser, and spent 3 minutes running it. Those 3 minutes were the longest Adrian had experienced since he'd stood in the empty nursery 11 days ago. The deputy came back. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "there's an active restraining order associated with your name and this address." He held out the license. "I'm going to ask you to get in your vehicle and leave this property." "I just want to see my son." "I understand that. You'll have that opportunity through the proper legal process." The deputy's voice was not cruel. It was just the voice of someone doing the work without editorializing. "Right now, I need you to leave." Adrian looked at Naomi one more time. She was still watching him. Noah had found a fold in her sweatshirt and was gripping it with one small fist. Adrian looked at that fist. Then he looked at Naomi. She still didn't speak. He got in the car. He drove back down the private road through the pine trees with the deputy's cruiser following him all the way to the county road to make sure, and he turned east, back toward Denver, back towards the airport, back toward the city, and the house, and the kitchen, with the ring on the counter and everything he had destroyed. He drove for 40 minutes before he pulled over. He sat on the side of the road with his hands on the wheel and his forehead pressed against them, and he stayed like that for a long time. He had not spoken to his son. He had not touched him. He had not said a single word that meant anything to anyone, including himself. He had violated a court order, driven 6 hours, and accomplished nothing except watching Naomi look at him with an expression that contained no hatred, which was in some ways much worse than hatred, and watching his son grip his mother's sweatshirt like it was the only solid thing in the world. He pulled back onto the road. He drove to Denver. He sat in the airport for 3 hours waiting for the next flight back to Seattle. His phone had 11 missed calls. Gerald Cho. Gerald Cho. Gerald Cho. Marcus. Gerald Cho. An unknown number. Marcus again. Gerald 4 more times. He called Gerald. Gerald picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you didn't go to the cabin," Gerald said without a greeting, in a voice Adrian had never heard from him before. Stripped of the professional composure, running on something closer to raw disbelief. Adrian said nothing. "Adrian." The word landed like a closed door. "Tell me. Right now." "I went to the cabin." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. Adrian counted. "The deputy filed a report," Gerald said. 40 minutes ago. Patricia Wren's office received notification 12 minutes after that." He stopped. Started again, and when he did, his voice had gone very quiet and very precise in the way voices go when the person speaking is controlling something enormous. "She is filing an emergency motion tomorrow morning. Contempt of court. Violation of the restraining order. She's going to use this to argue that you present an active risk to Naomi and to Noah, and she is going to ask the judge to revise the custody hearing parameters before we even get into the room." Adrian stared at the departure board. Seattle. Gate 34B. On time. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means that the supervised visitation we were hoping to negotiate as a starting point, the one thing I had some confidence we could get, is now in serious jeopardy." Gerald exhaled. Not a sigh. Something more compressed than that. "It means that instead of walking into that hearing with a man who made mistakes but demonstrated restraint, I am now walking in with a man who violated a court order to chase his wife and son across state lines 12 days after she left." A pause. "How does that look to you, from the outside?" Adrian closed his eyes. "It looks bad," he said. "It looks like exactly the man she said you were," Gerald said. The words arrived with a specific kind of precision that made Adrian feel something he was not accustomed to feeling. Not anger, not even shame, but something underneath both of those. Something he hadn't touched in years, maybe decades. The thing at the bottom of a person when everything else has been stripped away. It was a feeling like standing in a room with no furniture and no exits, and the light going bad, and understanding that you put yourself there. "What do I do?" he asked. "You come home," Gerald said. "You don't make another move, not one call, not one text, not one request through a third party, without my explicit instruction. You go to your house, you stay there, and tomorrow morning you are in my office at 8 o'clock and we begin rebuilding something from whatever is left." He paused. "And Adrian, if you make one more unilateral decision in this case, I will withdraw." Gerald, I mean it. No anger in it, just the clean final weight of a man who had reached his limit. I have spent 23 years protecting clients from themselves, and I cannot do that if the client will not let me. So I need to know right now, are you going to let me do my job? Adrian sat in the airport with the departure board clicking above him and the cold, recycled air and the noise of an airport that is a noise unlike any other noise, which is the sound of people in motion, people leaving places and arriving at them, people in the middle of things. Yes, he said. Then come home, Gerald said, and hung up. The flight back was full. Adrian sat in the middle seat between a teenager with headphones and an older woman who read a paperback thriller the entire flight without once looking up. Normal people. People in the middle of normal things. He sat between them and stared at the back of the seat in front of him and thought about Naomi's face in the clearing. Not what she said, because she hadn't said anything. Her face. He had known Naomi Reeves for 9 years. He had sat across from her at dinner tables. He had watched her argue cases before she left the firm. He had watched her be charming at his business events in a way that cost her something. He could tell even then she was good at it, but it cost her. And he had watched her become a mother in a way that was terrifying and complete. The way she had reorganized her entire being around this new person without anyone asking her to, without any of it being celebrated or even particularly noticed. And he had watched her look at him in that clearing. The thing about her face was that it held no performance. That was what had gotten him. In the 11 days since she'd left, he had constructed several versions of Naomi. The Naomi who was punishing him, the Naomi who was frightened, the Naomi who was making a tactical move in a legal chess game. None of those versions had required him to think too hard about the actual woman. They were all versions of Naomi as a problem to be solved. The woman in the clearing had not been a problem to be solved. She had been someone who had made a decision and was living inside it, and the calm of her face was not the calm of someone who had won something, but the calm of someone who had finally stopped losing. He landed in Seattle at 9:40. He drove home from the airport in the dark. He walked into the house through the front door and turned on the kitchen light and stood there. The ring was still on the counter. He'd been moving around it for 11 days, had not moved it or touched it since that first morning. Some stubborn refusal to disturb the last thing she'd left in place before she drove away. He looked at it for a long time. He picked it up, put it in his jacket pocket, walked to the bedroom. He did not sleep. He lay on top of the made bed in his clothes and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning the way sick people wait for morning, because morning is the thing that comes next, and next is the only thing available. Gerald's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Elliott Bay. Adrian had been here dozens of times over the years for business matters, acquisitions, contracts, the normal machinery of a wealthy man's professional life. He had always felt comfortable in this office. It had felt like neutral ground, the kind of room where problems were technical rather than personal. It did not feel like that now. Gerald was already there when Adrian arrived at 8. There were 2 other people in the office, a younger associate named Brianna, who sat with a laptop and a legal pad, and a woman Adrian didn't recognize, 50-ish, with short silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head. "This is Dr. Catherine Marsh," Gerald said. "She's a family court consultant. She advises clients on custody strategy." Adrian shook her hand. It was firm and brief, and she looked at him with the direct, undecorated attention of someone whose job was to assess people quickly. "Sit down," Gerald said. Adrian sat. "Patricia Wren filed the emergency motion at 8:02 this morning," Gerald said. "The judge is reviewing it today. We have until 5 o'clock to file a response." He set a document on the desk between them. This is what she filed. Adrian picked it up. He read it. It was 22 pages long. He read all 22 pages, and it took him 14 minutes, and by the end of it, he felt like something had been turned inside out. Naomi's attorney had constructed a document that was less a legal filing than it was a portrait, a detailed, sourced, dated portrait of a marriage and a fatherhood, or the absence of one. The hotel receipts, organized chronologically. Vanessa's statement, quoted directly. The recording transcript, printed in full with a note about audio file availability. A log. Apparently by Naomi over the previous 5 months. Of every night Adrian had not come home. Every morning he had left before Noah woke. Every pediatric appointment attended solely by Naomi, every feeding, every illness, every 3 a.m. where she had gotten up alone. There were dates and times next to each entry in the log. The last entry was the day before she left. It said, Adrian came home at 11:40 p.m. Did not check on Noah. Did not ask how we were, made a drink, went to bed. Adrian set the document on the desk. He looked at Dr. Marsh. She kept a log, he said. For 5 months, Dr. Marsh said. Every entry time stamped, cross-referenced with your phone location data, which her attorney obtained through the credit card statements. Your phone was pinging towers consistent with the Fairmont on 14 of the nights listed. He didn't say anything. Mr. Mercer, Dr. Marsh said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was very direct. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, because the way I help you from this point forward depends entirely on an accurate picture. Go ahead, he said. In the 4 months your son has been alive, how many times did you put him to bed? He looked at the table. I don't know. Estimate. Maybe. He stopped. Twice. Maybe twice. How many times did you feed him, bottle or otherwise? A few, early on. How many times did you get up with him at night? I was working early most mornings. I needed to. How many times, she said, not sharply, just with the patience of someone who has learned to wait out the deflection. Once, he said. Maybe once. She wrote this down. She wrote it down without any expression that indicated it surprised her, which was somehow worse than if she'd reacted. Do you know the name of his pediatrician? No. His birth weight? He opened his mouth, closed it. Did you attend any of his checkups? No. She set down her pen. Not in frustration, more like she had everything she needed and the pen was no longer required. Okay, she said. Here's where we are. She folded her hands on the table. The Colorado judge is likely to grant Patricia Wren's motion to some degree. The contempt violation is serious, but it is not unrecoverable, and the reason it is not unrecoverable is that judges in family court are ultimately making decisions about what serves the child. She paused. Which means the question is not whether you were a good husband. It's not whether you were faithful or present or any of the things in that filing. Those things are on the record now and they're going to stay there. Another pause. The only question that matters from this point forward is whether you can become a father. I am his father, Adrian said. Biologically, she said. Yes. She looked at him directly. But fatherhood is a practice. It is something you do repeatedly, in the ordinary moments, over time, without an audience. And right now, she picked up the 22-page filing and set it back down. Right now, the evidence of your practice is this. Adrian sat with that. What do I do? He asked. First thing, she said, is that you stop reacting and start preparing. You are not going to win this in the next few weeks. You are going to begin a process that takes months. She looked at him steadily. Can you do that? I don't have a choice, he said. You had a choice yesterday, she said evenly. You made it. Now you have different choices. Gerald cleared his throat. The other thing, he said, is that Patricia Wren has requested the hearing be moved forward. She wants to argue the contempt violation in front of the judge before the full custody hearing. The judge has discretionary authority to do this. When? 3 weeks, Gerald said. Possibly 2. 2 weeks. Adrian looked at the window. Elliott Bay was gray this morning, the kind of gray that is flat rather than dramatic. The gray of weather that has no interest in being noticed. There's something else, Gerald said, and his voice changed slightly, not softening, but shifting into a register that was more careful. Patricia Wren attached something to the motion that I need to prepare you for. He opened a folder and slid a single page across the desk. It was a photograph. Adrian picked it up. It was a screenshot of a text message exchange. The timestamp in the corner indicated it was 8 months ago, 2 months before Noah was born. The messages were between 2 numbers, one of which Adrian recognized as his own. The other number he didn't know, and the contact name in the thread simply said V. He read the messages. The first one, from his number, said, Sometimes I think this whole thing was a mistake. The baby, the house, all of it. The response, from V. Then why are you still doing it? His response, Because I don't know how to get out without losing everything. Her response, She doesn't know you at all, does she? His response, No, and she never will. He set the page down. He looked at Gerald. Gerald was watching him with an expression that had in it everything a person feels when they have tried hard to prepare for something. And the preparation has still not been enough. I sent that, Adrian said. Yes. She found it. Her attorney found it. They subpoenaed your phone records as part of the discovery process. Gerald paused. This will be read in court, Adrian, in full, by Naomi's attorney, in front of the judge. Adrian sat very still. She doesn't know you at all, does she? No. And she never will. He had written those words in a hotel room while his pregnant wife was at home 8 months ago, while she was growing a person inside her body, while she was preparing a nursery with pale yellow paint and small white curtains, while she was doing all of it without complaint and without much help, and with the quiet, methodical love of a woman who had decided that the marriage she was in was worth holding together. And he had been in a hotel room writing those words. He stood up. The chair scraped back and he walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Below him, 14 floors down, the city moved the way cities move, with indifference, with volume, with the grinding normalcy of thousands of people inside their own lives. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned around. Tell me what I have to do, he said. His voice was different. Gerald noticed it. Dr. Marsh noticed it. Even Brianna at the corner table with the laptop looked up briefly. It wasn't the voice of a man negotiating. It wasn't the voice of a man calculating odds or weighing outcomes or assessing leverage. It was just the voice of a man who had finally run out of everything except the truth. Tell me what I have to do, he said again. All of it, every step, and I will do it. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Sit down, Gerald said quietly. And this time Adrian sat down and did not move, and he listened. The 2 weeks before the emergency hearing were the longest of Adrian Mercer's life, and he had lived through a bankruptcy scare at 34 and a hostile acquisition attempt at 42 that had nearly cost him everything he'd built, so that was saying something real. Dr. Catherine Marsh gave him a list on a yellow legal pad at the end of that first morning in Gerald's office. It was not a long list. It was 8 items. She wrote them in a plain, unhurried hand and slid it across the table and said, "Start today. Not tomorrow. Today." He read it on the elevator ride down to the lobby and read it again in the car, and by the time he got home, he had memorized it the way you memorize something that your survival depends on. The first item was therapy. Not optional, she had written next to it. Court-approved provider. Call before noon. He called before noon. The therapist's name was Dr. Raymond Osei, a man in his mid-50s who worked out of an office in Capitol Hill and had a specialty in men's behavioral work, which was a phrase Adrian had never encountered before and which made him feel, initially, like he was being asked to admit to something before he'd even sat down. He got an appointment for the following morning. He drove there himself. He sat in the waiting room for 8 minutes, looking at a painting of a river on the opposite wall, and tried to prepare himself for whatever came next. What came next was Raymond Osei opening the door and saying simply, "Come in, Mr. Mercer," and Adrian walking into a room with 2 chairs and a small table and a window that looked out at the back of another building, and sitting down. "Tell me why you're here," Raymond said. "My wife left," Adrian said. "She took our son." "Okay." Raymond had a notepad, but he didn't open it. "Tell me about your son." Adrian opened his mouth. The sentence that came out was not what he expected. It was not a legal narrative or a timeline or a list of grievances. It was, "I don't know him." Raymond looked at him. "He's 4 months old," Adrian said. "And I don't know him. I don't know what makes him laugh. I don't know what frightens him. I don't know if he has a sound he makes before he falls asleep or after he wakes up or—" He stopped. His throat had done something unexpected. He pressed one fist against his mouth for a moment, not performing anything, just managing something that had arrived without warning. "I missed it," he said. "I was right there, and I missed all of it." Raymond waited. "I keep thinking—" Adrian's voice steadied. "I keep thinking there's a version of this where I negotiate my way back into his life, where I find the right argument, the right attorney, the right strategy." He looked at his hands. "But it's not a negotiation. He's a baby. He doesn't know my name." He swallowed. "How do you negotiate with that?" "You don't," Raymond said. "You show up." Adrian looked up. That's the whole answer, Raymond said. There's no strategy that replaces presence. There's no argument that substitutes for being there. He leaned forward slightly. The question I'd like to spend our time on is why showing up felt so difficult before. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in 2 weeks that didn't involve legal terminology, and it landed differently because of that. I don't know, Adrian said. That's a fine place to start, Raymond said. The second item on Catherine Marsh's list was a parenting course, a structured 12-week program run through a family services organization in Bellevue that the court recognized. Adrian walked in on the first Tuesday night and sat in a circle with 8 other people, most of whom were younger than him, 2 of whom were women, one of whom was a man in a Seahawks sweatshirt who looked like he worked in construction and was clearly furious about being there. Adrian understood the furious man completely. The facilitator was a woman named Gloria, who was somewhere in her 60s and had the particular manner of someone who had heard every excuse and every rationalization that a person could produce and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of them, and had replaced surprise with a kind of bedrock patience. She handed out a worksheet on the first night about infant developmental stages, and Adrian looked at it and understood approximately 40% of what he was reading. He had never studied infant development. He had assumed, in the vague and unexamined way he'd assumed most things about fatherhood, that it would come naturally, that proximity would generate knowledge, that presence would generate understanding. He had not been sufficiently present for that theory to be tested. He studied the worksheet. He asked questions. He wrote notes in the margin. The construction worker glanced over at him once and then looked away, and Adrian couldn't tell if the look was contemptuous or simply surprised. He didn't spend time worrying about it. He was done spending time on things that weren't Noah. The third item on the list was a letter. Not to the court, not to Gerald, to Noah. Catherine had been specific about this. Write it to him as he is right now, she said. Not the child he'll be at 10 or 15, the baby he is now. What you want him to know. What you're sorry for. What you're going to do differently. She had paused. You won't give it to him. It's for you. But the judge may ask whether you've done therapeutic writing exercises. And more importantly, you need to know what you're fighting for beyond the legal outcome. He sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night and started the letter 4 times. The first 3 attempts became legal arguments within 2 paragraphs. He crumpled them. The 4th attempt started with, Noah, I don't know if you make sounds when you sleep. I want to know that. I want to be someone you trust enough to fall asleep near. He wrote for an hour, 2 pages. He didn't crumple that one. He folded it and put it in the drawer of his nightstand and did not read it again but knew it was there, which was enough. The emergency hearing was on a Thursday morning in a courtroom in downtown Seattle because Patricia Wren had successfully argued that the contempt violation needed to be addressed in Washington rather than Colorado, given that the restraining order had been issued with Seattle jurisdiction. Adrian arrived in a gray suit he'd had pressed and a tie that Marcus had insisted on. You're asking for forgiveness, not closing a deal, but you still need to look like a man who takes the room seriously. And sat next to Gerald at the respondent's table and watched Patricia Wren arrange her materials at the opposing table with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and found the preparation genuinely satisfying. She was smaller than he'd expected, mid-40s with dark hair cut close and reading glasses on a thin chain. She did not look at Adrian when she sat down. This was also, he would realize later, a deliberate choice. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Denton, who had been on the family court bench for 9 years, and had the face of someone who had absorbed enough human suffering to have stopped reacting visibly to most of it, but had not stopped caring, which was a specific and difficult combination to maintain, and she maintained it. Naomi was in the courtroom, Adrian, or thought he had. He looked at her when he came in. She was seated behind Patricia Wren's table to the side, with a composure that appeared complete. She was wearing a navy blouse he didn't recognize, which meant she'd bought new clothes since she left, which meant she was making a life. She had her hair up. She looked at the front of the courtroom, not at Adrian. He sat down and looked at the front of the courtroom too. Gerald leaned close. Don't look at her, he said quietly. Look at Judge Denton. I know, Adrian said. You also knew not to get on a plane, Gerald said. Fair. The hearing lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. Patricia Wren was precise, unhurried, and utterly without mercy. She walked Judge Denton through the contempt violation with the economy of someone who had a strong case and knew that clarity was more persuasive than volume. She introduced the deputy's report. She introduced the flight record, obtained through Adrian's credit card company. She introduced Daryl Okafor's invoice, which she had somehow obtained through discovery and which established that Adrian had hired a private investigator to locate his wife while a restraining order was pending. Mr. Mercer was informed of the restraining order by his own attorney at 12:47 p.m. on the relevant date, she said, standing at the podium with her notes. He booked a flight to Denver at 1:18 p.m. the same afternoon. She paused for effect that she didn't actually need because the math was already doing the work. He arrived at the property at 11:40 a.m. the following morning. He was asked to leave by Miss Mercer's friend and declined. He called out to Miss Mercer directly, despite the restraining order's explicit prohibition. He left only when a deputy arrived. Judge Denton made a note. Her face did not change. Ms. Wren, the judge said, what is your client seeking as remedy? We are seeking a formal contempt finding, Your Honor. We are seeking to ensure that the parameters of the upcoming custody hearing include explicit discussion of Mr. Mercer's willingness to comply with court orders, given this incident. And we are seeking an extension of the current restraining order through the date of the full hearing. Gerald stood when it was his turn, and he was good. Adrian had always known Gerald was good. That was why he'd paid for him for 20 years. And he was measured, and he was honest, which was a choice they had discussed at length and which had been Catherine Marsh's recommendation. Do not minimize. Do not deny. Acknowledge and redirect. Your Honor, Gerald said, my client has already acknowledged that his decision to travel to Colorado was a serious error in judgment. He is not contesting the contempt finding. What I am here to ask this court to consider is the context of that error. A man who had not seen his son in 11 days, who was operating under significant emotional distress, who made an impulsive decision that he regrets entirely. He paused. What I am also here to demonstrate is that my client, in the 2 weeks since that decision, has taken every voluntary remedial step available to him. He has begun therapy with a licensed provider. He is enrolled in a court-recognized parenting education program. He has complied fully with every other aspect of the existing orders. Gerald set down his notes. Adrian Mercer made a terrible mistake. He has made several. What I am asking this court to believe, and what I intend to demonstrate through his conduct going forward, is that he is committed to being a different man than the one reflected in that filing. Judge Denton looked from Gerald to Patricia Wren to Adrian. Mr. Mercer, she said, I'm going to ask you directly. Why did you go to that cabin? Adrian stood. Gerald had prepped him for this. They had practiced it. He knew what the answer was supposed to sound like. Measured, remorseful, forward-looking. He had the answer ready. He looked at Judge Denton and the prepared answer dissolved. Because I was afraid, he said. Not of losing a custody case. Afraid that... He stopped, started again. My son doesn't know my face. I stood in that clearing and I watched him hold on to his mother's shirt, and he didn't look at me, and I understood that I had done that I had made myself a stranger to him by not being there. He paused. I went to Colorado because I thought if I could just be in the same space as him, even for a few minutes, it would mean something. It didn't. It was the wrong choice, and it made things worse, and I knew that before I got on the plane, and I went anyway. He looked at the judge steadily. I don't have a better explanation than that. I'm sorry. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Denton looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Mercer, she said, I find you in contempt of this court's order. You will pay a fine of $2,500, remitted within 30 days. The restraining order will remain in effect and will be extended as requested through the custody hearing. She looked at both tables. I want to say something to both parties before we adjourn. I have been on this bench for 9 years. I have presided over custody cases that were driven by genuine concern for children, and I have presided over custody cases that were driven by adults using children as instruments of conflict. She set down her pen. I have not yet determined which category this case falls into. I intend to find out at the full hearing. She looked at Gerald. Your client would benefit enormously from demonstrating between now and the hearing date that the steps you described are genuine rather than strategic. Judges notice the difference. She looked at Patricia Wren. Your client has clearly been through something very difficult, Judge Denton said. This court recognizes that. It also expects that all decisions made going forward will be guided by what serves Noah, not by what satisfies any grievance, however legitimate. She looked at both of them. We are adjourned. Adrian walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps in the cold November air and breathed. Marcus was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He'd sat in the back of the courtroom for the full 3 hours without saying a word, and now he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at his brother. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked. "Like I got hit by a truck," Adrian said. "Good," Marcus nodded. "That means you're starting to understand the weight of it." They walked to Gerald's car in the parking structure, and Gerald ran through the immediate next steps in the brisk, forward-moving way he had, and Adrian listened and asked the right questions, and by the time they separated, it was early afternoon and the city was doing its normal afternoon thing, and Adrian drove himself home and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes because walking into the house still required effort he had to consciously gather. He went inside. He changed out of the suit. He opened his laptop and spent 2 hours studying infant developmental milestones from a website the parenting course facilitator had recommended. And he wrote notes in a composition notebook he'd bought specifically for this. And when he finished, he sat back and looked at what he'd written and felt, for the first time, not like a man executing a legal strategy, but like a man trying to learn something real. The full custody hearing was 6 weeks out. 6 weeks is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of a man trying to rebuild something from foundational rubble while complying with a restraining order, attending therapy twice a week, completing a parenting course, and trying to maintain a business that had begun to suffer from his 2 months of distracted management, 6 weeks was simultaneously too short to accomplish what needed accomplishing and too long to exist in suspension. He went to Raymond Osei on Monday and Friday mornings. Raymond was not gentle in the way that people sometimes expect therapists to be gentle. He was not warm in a performed way. He did not nod with exaggerated understanding or mirror Adrian's language back at him in ways that were meant to feel like insight. He was direct and curious, and occasionally said things that stopped Adrian completely. On the third session, Raymond said, "When you were growing up, was there a man in your life who showed you what it looked like to stay?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. "My father left when I was 9. And after that?" "My mother, she stayed." He paused. "She worked 2 jobs. She stayed completely." "Did you ever think about why your father left?" "I thought he was a coward." "And now?" Adrian looked at the window, the back of another building, a pigeon on a ledge. "Now I think he was afraid of something he didn't know how to name." He paused. "Which is not the same as forgiving him." "No," Raymond said, "it's not." "But it's—" Adrian stopped, turned it over. "It's more complicated than I let it be for 40 years. Raymond let that sit. "I became him," Adrian said. It was not a question. "You made similar choices," Raymond said carefully. "That's not the same as being him. The difference is what you do with the understanding. He didn't do anything with it." "You're here," Raymond said. He wasn't. On the 4th Tuesday of the parenting course, the class was given a demonstration module with infant care equipment, dolls weighted to approximate infant mass, car seats, baby carriers. The exercise was to demonstrate proper techniques for holding, supporting, and securing an infant. Adrian had held Noah twice in the 4 months of his son's life, both times briefly, both times with the rigid, terrified posture of a man who had no idea what he was doing. He practiced with the weighted doll until Gloria told him his technique was solid. He drove home that night and practiced again with a throw pillow at the kitchen table until he could do it without thinking. He was aware that this was slightly absurd. A 51-year-old man practicing holding a pillow in his empty kitchen at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. He didn't let the absurdity stop him. He called Marcus afterward. "I'm learning how to hold a baby," he said. "Took you a while," Marcus said. "Shut up," Adrian said. There was no heat in it. "How's the course?" "Good," Adrian said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "The woman who runs it, Gloria, she doesn't let you coast. She asks you things, and she waits until you actually answer them instead of just making sounds." "Sounds exhausting." "It is." He leaned against the counter. "Marcus, what was he like? When Diane had Jasmine, how did you know what to do?" There was a brief silence. Marcus and Diane's daughter Jasmine was 7 now, and watching Marcus with her had been one of the things Adrian had filed away without examining. A brother who showed up for recitals and school pickups and ordinary Tuesday dinners, who seemed to find the ordinary comfortable rather than confining. Adrian had found his own life too interesting for ordinariness. He had found himself too important for it. I didn't know what to do, Marcus said. You're there, and the thing happens, and then you handle the next thing. A pause. The trick is actually being there for the thing to happen. I know, Adrian said. I know you know, Marcus said. I'm just saying it anyway. 4 weeks before this hearing, Gerald called with new information. Patricia Wren has submitted her witness list, he said. She's calling Naomi, which is expected. She's calling a child psychologist named Dr. Elena Voss, who has evaluated both parties based on submitted documentation, financial records, the log, the parenting record. She's also calling... A pause. She's calling Vanessa. Adrian sat down. Vanessa agreed to testify? She was subpoenaed, Gerald said, but her attorney, she has her own attorney now, indicated she intends to cooperate fully. He paused. I want to prepare you for what her testimony is likely to contain. The recording, Adrian said. The recording is already in the written record, but live testimony has a different impact than a transcript. Gerald cleared his throat. She'll likely be asked about the nature of the relationship, the duration, and the specific statements you made about Naomi and Noah, including the text messages. He paused. Adrian, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Are there other communications? Other texts, emails, any recordings we don't know about? He thought about it carefully. The way Gerald had asked the question told him that the correct answer was not a fast answer. There was a voicemail, he said slowly. I left her one, Vanessa, a few weeks before Naomi left. I'd had a bad night. I'd been drinking. I said... He stopped. I said some things about Naomi that were not kind. The silence on the other end was brief and significant. What things? Gerald said. I said she'd become someone I didn't recognize. I said I didn't know how to be in the same house as her anymore. He paused. I said something about that she'd changed since the baby, and I didn't know if I could do this. Do what specifically? Be married to her. Another silence. Has Vanessa's attorney been in contact with Patricia Wren's office? Gerald asked. I don't know. I'll find out, Gerald said. In the meantime, I want to add something to your preparation for the hearing. The judge is going to hear a lot about who you were. I need to make sure she also sees who you're becoming, which means every session with Raymond needs to be documented. Every course attendance, anything. Are you keeping records of all of it? Yes, Adrian said. Catherine told me to from the beginning. Good, Gerald said, because in 3.5 weeks, those records are what stand between you and losing all meaningful access to your son. A beat. Keep going. 3 weeks before the hearing, Gerald submitted Adrian's own witness list and supporting documentation to the court. It included Raymond Osei's professional attestation of Adrian's engagement in therapy. It included Gloria's attendance record from the parenting course and her written assessment of Adrian's participation, which she'd agreed to provide and which, when Gerald read it to him over the phone, described a man who had come in defensive and left willing to be taught, which was not poetry but was the truth. It included a financial accounting showing that Adrian had voluntarily transferred a sum equivalent to 6 months of household expenses into a segregated account designated for Noah's care, not because any court had ordered him to, but because Catherine Marsh had told him that voluntary action carries more weight than compelled action, and because it was also simply the right thing to do. It included a letter from Dr. Catherine Marsh summarizing her professional assessment of Adrian's trajectory, which was not glowing, she was incapable of glowing, professionally, but which used the phrase demonstrable behavioral change and consistent effort and genuine reckoning rather than tactical performance. What it could not include was a single moment of actual contact with Noah. 6.5 weeks after Naomi had left, Adrian had not held his son, not spoken to his son, not been in the same room as his son, except for those 2 minutes in a Colorado clearing where Noah had been entirely unaware of him. This was the thing that Raymond kept returning to in their sessions. Not the legal situation, not the marriage. The fact of the distance and what Adrian intended to do with whatever access the court granted. Whatever they give you, Raymond said, in their session 2 weeks before the hearing, it will not feel like enough. It will be supervised, it will be brief, and it will be uncomfortable for Noah because you are a stranger to him. He looked at Adrian steadily. You need to be prepared for that. Prepared enough that his discomfort doesn't make you pull away. Why would I pull away? Because men like you, Raymond said without any cruelty, are accustomed to being competent, to walking into a situation and being capable. A baby crying at you when you try to hold him is a particular kind of failure that people with very high standards for themselves sometimes cannot tolerate. Adrian looked at the window. He's going to cry, Raymond said. He might cry every visit for the first month. That is not failure. That is the completely predictable response of an infant being held by an unfamiliar person. He paused. What matters is what you do while he's crying, whether you stay or whether you hand him back. I'll stay, Adrian said. I know you think that, Raymond said. I need you to feel it. 1 week before the hearing, Vanessa called him. He almost didn't answer. He stared at her name on the screen for 3 rings. Then he picked up. I'm testifying next Thursday, she said. No greeting, no preamble. Just Vanessa, direct as always. I know, he said. I want you to know what I'm going to say. She paused. I'm going to tell the truth. All of it. I'm not going to protect you, and I'm not going to perform cruelty to impress anyone. I'm going to answer what they ask me, and I'm going to be accurate. Okay, he said. The voicemail, she said. He closed his eyes. They have it, she said. Her attorney has a copy. I don't know how. I didn't give it to them. A pause that felt careful. I want you to know I didn't give them that. I believe you, he said. Adrian. She stopped, started again. I've been thinking about this a lot, about what I was in this situation. Another pause, longer this time. I wasn't the innocent party. I knew you were married. I knew there was a baby. I told myself it was your marriage, not mine, and that made it compartmentalized, easy enough. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before, which was the quality of a person assessing themselves honestly and not enjoying what they found. She was real. Naomi was a real person, and I made her abstract on purpose. He didn't say anything. I think that's something I'm going to have to sit with for a while, Vanessa said. Me too, he said. Good luck next week, she said. Vanessa. He stopped. Yeah? I'm sorry, he said, for using you, for making you part of something that was never fair to you either. She was quiet for a moment. That's the first time you've said that. I know, he said. I should have said it sooner. She hung up without responding to that, which he thought was probably the right call. The night before the hearing, Adrian sat at the kitchen table with the composition notebook and the 2 months of accumulated notes, developmental stages, parenting techniques, the things Raymond had said that had rearranged something in him, the questions Gloria had asked that he'd had to sit with for days before he could answer them honestly. He read through all of it. Then he opened the drawer of the nightstand in the bedroom and took out the letter he'd written to Noah. He read it slowly. It was 2 pages in his own handwriting, slightly cramped in the way his handwriting always cramped when he was writing fast and feeling things, and it said things that he would not have been capable of saying 2 months ago. Not because the feelings hadn't existed. He thought they had, somewhere beneath the layers of avoidance and performance and the constant forward motion of a man who had used ambition as a way of never having to stop and examine what he was actually building. He put the letter back in the envelope, put it back in the drawer. He tried to sleep. He didn't sleep. At 4 in the morning, he got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter where Naomi's wedding ring had rested for 6 weeks. He'd moved it to the drawer months ago, in a moment of, not readiness exactly, but some recognition that leaving it there was a performance for an audience that wasn't present. He thought about Naomi, not strategically, not legally. He thought about her the way he should have been thinking about her for years, as a specific, complicated, remarkable person who had walked through his life and through a marriage and through a pregnancy and through 4 months of new motherhood largely without him, and who had responded to that abandonment not with bitterness or dysfunction, but with a precision and a clarity that had, in his most honest moments, taken his breath away. She had not run scared. She had planned. She had documented. She had called an attorney in another state and found a friend with a cabin and arranged a life with a 4-month-old while maintaining the appearance of normalcy long enough to complete the preparation. That was not the act of a broken person. That was the act of someone who had been forced to find out exactly what she was made of and had found out the answer was more than she'd needed to be as long as she was with him. He sat with that. He thought about Noah, about what Noah would remember of this period of his life, which was nothing, because he was 4 months old and the brain doesn't hold on to things yet at 4 months. And there was both relief and agony in that. Relief because the damage was not yet the kind that scars a child's memory. Agony because the window for being there from the beginning had already closed and could not be reopened, only a new beginning made from wherever they were now. He drank his coffee. He showered. He put on the suit Marcus had selected, not the gray one from the contempt hearing, a different one, navy, which Marcus said communicated sincerity rather than power. And Adrian had long ago accepted that Marcus understood optics in human terms better than he did. He drove to the courthouse in the dark, arriving 40 minutes before he needed to, and sat in the parking garage with the engine off and the composition notebook on the passenger seat and thought about what Judge Denton had said at the contempt hearing. I have not yet determined which category this case falls into. He knew which category it was. He had known it since he'd sat on the kitchen floor the first morning and looked at the bank balance. He had known it in a way he'd been fighting and negotiating and strategizing around for 2 months, and today he was going to stop fighting it. Not because Gerald had advised him to, not because Catherine Marsh had mapped it as the optimal approach. Because it was the truth, and the truth was the only thing he had left that was worth anything. He walked into the courthouse at 7:52 in the morning. Gerald was already there. Catherine Marsh was there. The associate Brianna was there with her laptop and her legal pads. They stood in a cluster in the hallway outside the courtroom, and Gerald ran through the structure of the day one more time, and Adrian listened with the specific quality of listening he had developed over the past 8 weeks, which was the quality of a man who has learned to pay attention to the room he's actually in rather than the room he'd rather be in. When Wren does her opening, Gerald said, there will be things said about you that are accurate and things said about you that are framed to serve her narrative. Do not react. Do not write notes to me. Do not look at Naomi. Look at Judge Denton. I know, Adrian said. When it's your turn to address the court, Gerald said, we stick to what we prepared. I know, Adrian said again. If you go off script, Gerald. Adrian looked at him. I know, I'm not going off script. Gerald studied him for a moment. Whatever he saw, it seemed to satisfy him enough to nod. The courtroom doors opened. Adrian walked in and sat at the respondent's table and set the composition notebook in front of him. Not to reference, just to have there, because it was the physical record of the person he'd been trying to become, and he wanted it present in the room. And he looked at the front of the courtroom and breathed. Behind him, he heard the courtroom filling. He did not turn around, but he heard it when the door opened behind him, and he heard footsteps, and he heard, underneath the murmur of the room, the specific small sound that cut through everything else. The brief, questioning, searching sound that a 5.5-month-old baby makes when a room is new and there are too many people in it. Noah was in the courtroom. Adrian did not turn around. He stared at the judge's bench and his hands were flat on the table and his jaw was set, and he did not turn around. But he heard his son. For the first time in 2 months and 11 days, he heard his son, and the sound moved through him like something breaking open in exactly the right way. And he understood with the absolute clarity of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself that everything he was about to do in this room, every word, every acknowledgement, every stripped-down honest thing he had spent 2 months learning how to say, he was going to do it for that sound. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Claire Denton entered and took her seat and looked out at the courtroom with the expression of a woman who had heard everything and still believed something could be different. We are here in the matter of Mercer versus Mercer, she said. Patricia Wren rose from her chair with the smooth, practiced motion of someone about to take apart a building brick by brick, and she began. Patricia Wren took exactly 47 minutes to deliver her opening, and she used all 47 of them. She was not theatrical. That was the thing Adrian had not anticipated. He had prepared himself for someone who performed outrage, who used volume and gesture to manipulate the room, the way some attorneys did when they knew the emotional content of their case was strong enough to carry that kind of presentation. Wren did not do that. She was quiet, organized, and merciless in the way that a very sharp instrument is merciless. Not through force, but through precision. She began with the log. Not with the affair. Not with the financial manipulation. Not with the contempt violation. She began with Naomi's log of the 5 months before she left, and she read from it selectively, choosing entries the way a careful editor chooses sentences. Not the most dramatic ones, but the most ordinary ones, because ordinary suffering, when it accumulates, is more devastating than any single catastrophe. February 3rd. Noah had his 2-month checkup. Adrian was in Portland. I drove myself. Noah weighed 11 pounds, 4 ounces. Dr. Kessler said he's healthy. I texted Adrian a photo. He responded 6 hours later with a thumbs up emoji. She read it without inflection. February 19th. Noah cried for 3 hours tonight. Colic, I think. I walked him around the kitchen until 2 in the morning. Adrian was asleep. I didn't wake him because he had a breakfast meeting. Another entry. March 8th. Noah smiled for the first time today. A real smile, not gas. I had no one to tell. She set down the page. The courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms go quiet when a room full of professionally composed people is doing the work of not reacting. Adrian stared at the judge's bench. He did not look at Gerald. He did not look at Wren. He absolutely did not look behind him at where Naomi was sitting. He stared at the bench and breathed and let the words land where they landed because they were true, and he had known they were true. And part of what the last 2 months had been about was learning to hold true things without deflecting from them. March 8th. Noah smiled for the first time today. I had no one to tell. He had not known about the first smile. He didn't know where he'd been. Somewhere. Nowhere near that kitchen. Wren moved to the financial evidence next. She walked Judge Denton through the account history with the same unhurried precision, establishing not just what had been done, but the timeline of when Adrian had and hadn't noticed. The withdrawals that should have prompted questions, the credit card statements he'd failed to review, the ways in which a man who managed multi-million-dollar real estate portfolios with forensic attention had managed to remain entirely unaware of his household's financial texture for years. The picture that emerges, Wren said, standing at the podium with her notes, is not a picture of a man who was cruel in a dramatic sense. There were no physical altercations. There was no substance abuse. What this evidence shows, Your Honor, is something that is in some ways more corrosive. A man who was consistently, methodically, and comprehensively absent from a marriage and a child while maintaining the outward structure of both. She paused. Miss Mercer did not leave impulsively. She left after 5 months of documentation because she needed to be certain that what she was experiencing was real, that it would be believed, and that her son would be protected. She looked at Judge Denton. The question before this court is not whether Adrian Mercer loved his son in some abstract, unexpressed sense. The question is what love looks like in practice, in action, in presence. And on that question, the record speaks with considerable clarity. She sat down. Judge Denton looked at Gerald. Mr. Cho. Gerald stood. He was measured, as always, and he was honest, as they had agreed, and he made the argument that 2 months of work had earned him the right to make, that the man who had appeared in the log was not the man who sat in this courtroom now, and that the court's function in family matters was not solely to adjudicate the past, but to serve the future well-being of the child. He referenced Raymond Osei's documentation. He referenced the parenting course. He referenced the voluntary financial transfer. He was careful and accurate, and he never asked the court to forgive anything that hadn't been earned. When he sat down, he leaned toward Adrian and said, very quietly, "You're up in 40 minutes." Dr. Elena Voss testified for 35 minutes. She was a child psychologist in her late 40s with a composed academic manner and the particular gift of being able to say devastating things in language so clinical that the devastation arrived slightly delayed, like sound after lightning. She testified that based on available documentation, she had not been permitted to evaluate Noah directly, as he was an infant, but had reviewed medical records, the parenting log, witness statements, and written submissions. The existing attachment between Noah and his mother was strong, consistent, and well-established. She testified that Noah had no meaningful established attachment to his father based on available evidence, which was not a moral judgment but a developmental observation. Infants attached to consistent caregivers, and the record indicated that Adrian Mercer had not functioned as a consistent caregiver in any measurable sense during Noah's first 4.5 months. Wren asked her, "In your professional opinion, what would be the most appropriate contact arrangement for the respondent at this stage, given the infant's developmental needs?" "Supervised visitation," Dr. Voss said, "with a structured and gradual introduction schedule designed to allow the infant to build familiarity with the respondent over time." The sessions should be brief initially, no more than 2 hours, in a neutral, child-centered environment with a focus on the respondent learning to read and respond to the infant's cues rather than on the respondent's emotional needs in the encounter. And what risks exist if contact is introduced too aggressively? Disruption of the child's sense of security. Elevated cortisol responses in the infant during contact that can, over time, create negative associative responses to the unfamiliar caregiver. She paused. In plain language, if the infant consistently experiences distress in the presence of someone, the infant begins to associate that person with distress, which makes future attachment significantly more difficult. Thank you, Wren said. Gerald cross-examined her competently. He established that Dr. Voss had not evaluated Adrian directly, that her conclusions were based entirely on submitted documentation, and that the documentation did not capture the changes of the past 8 weeks. Dr. Voss acknowledged these limitations with the calm of someone who had testified enough times to know that acknowledging limitations strengthened rather than weakened professional credibility. When she stepped down, Adrian looked at the notebook on the table in front of him. He did not open it, he just looked at it. Behind him, Noah made a small sound. Then silence. Then another small sound. Not crying, just the ambient sound of an infant being managed by someone who knew how. The small, soft redirections of a competent mother keeping a baby calm in a courthouse. Adrian kept his eyes forward. Vanessa testified for 22 minutes. She came in wearing a dark blazer and the expression of someone who had prepared for something difficult and was going to get through it with her dignity intact, regardless of what it cost. She did not look at Adrian when she sat in the witness box. She looked at Patricia Wren. Wren walked her through it carefully. The relationship, the duration, the hotel, the conversations. Vanessa answered everything with a directness that Adrian recognized. It was the thing he'd always valued about her, the absence of performance. And hearing it in this context, hearing the architecture of his 6 months with her described in clear, undecorated sentences in a courtroom, made him feel something he hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of grief for her as well. She had been used. She had not been entirely innocent. She'd acknowledged that herself on the phone. But she had been used, and the evidence of that use was now being extracted from her in a courthouse in front of an audience, and she was handling it with more composure than she owed anyone. Wren asked her about the voicemail. In that voicemail, Wren said, what did Mr. Mercer say about his wife? Vanessa was quiet for a moment. He said she'd become a stranger to him. He said he didn't know how to be in the house anymore. She paused. He said, she stopped, started again. He said he felt like the baby had taken her somewhere he couldn't follow. Did he express any attachment to his son in that voicemail? No, Vanessa said. In your 6 months together, did he speak about Noah frequently? She considered this. He mentioned him, not in the way. She paused, and for the first time her composure showed a fracture just at the edge. He didn't talk about him the way a father would. He talked about him the way you talk about a situation. The courtroom absorbed this. Thank you, Wren said. Gerald cross-examined. He asked Vanessa whether, in her personal observations of Adrian over the past 2 months, she had seen any change. She said she couldn't speak to that directly, as they'd had limited contact. He asked whether she believed Adrian was capable of genuine change. Wren objected, speculation, and the judge sustained it. Gerald sat down. Vanessa stepped down from the witness box and walked out of the courtroom and did not look at Adrian as she passed, and he did not look at her. And whatever had been between them finished quietly in that non-exchange, without drama, the way things that were never quite real tend to end. Naomi testified for 41 minutes. She walked to the witness box with the same composed steadiness she'd carried in the Colorado clearing, the same quality of a person who had decided what they were going to do and was doing it without apology or performance. She sat down and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at Patricia Wren, and she answered the question she was asked with the precision of a woman who had once been a lawyer and had not forgotten how to inhabit a courtroom. She described the marriage, not with bitterness. That was the thing that made it impossible to look away from. She described it the way a doctor describes a diagnosis, accurately, with specificity, without emotional editorializing that might compromise the precision. She described the postpartum period, the nights alone, the pediatrician appointments, the first smile that she'd had no one to tell. Her voice did not waver. She did not look at Adrian. Wren asked her, "Miss Mercer, what was the moment when you decided to leave?" Naomi was quiet for a moment. "It wasn't a moment," she said. I was sitting in the kitchen one night. Noah was asleep. It was about 2 in the morning, and I'd been up with him for 3 hours, and I was exhausted in a way I can't fully describe. And I realized I was hoping Adrian would come home. Not because I wanted him there. I'd stopped wanting that months before. I was hoping he'd come home because I needed another adult to be there, just physically present." She paused. "And then I realized he wouldn't. And then I realized I'd stopped expecting him to. And those two things together..." She stopped. "I understood that I had already left the marriage. I'd just stayed in the house." The courtroom was very still. Gerald cross-examined her for 15 minutes. He was respectful. They had discussed at length that anything that read as aggressive toward Naomi would be catastrophic. And he focused on establishing that Naomi herself had acknowledged, in her filings, that she was not seeking to permanently exclude Adrian from Noah's life, only to ensure that contact was structured appropriately. She confirmed this. She was consistent and unshakable, and Gerald did not push where pushing would only cause damage. When she stepped down and returned to her seat, she passed behind Adrian's table, and for the first time since she'd walked in, Adrian turned his head slightly. Not enough to see her face. Enough to, he didn't know, register her presence, acknowledge it in the only way available to him. She did not acknowledge him back. He returned his eyes to the front. When Gerald called Adrian to testify, he walked to the witness box with the notebook and set it on the railing beside him, and then he looked out at the courtroom. He had expected it to feel like walking into a negotiation. It felt like walking into a reckoning, which is a different thing entirely. A negotiation is about what you can get. A reckoning is about what is true, and the distinction had finally, after 51 years, become meaningful to him. Gerald walked him through the prepared testimony. The affair, which he confirmed without minimizing. The absence, which he described without excusing. The financial picture, which he characterized accurately. The contempt violation, which he addressed directly. "I knew it was wrong before I did it, and I did it anyway, because I was operating on fear rather than reason, and I will not make that choice again." When Gerald asked him about the changes of the past 2 months, Adrian answered from the notebook, not reading from it, just aware of it. And he described the therapy, the course, the letter to Noah he had written at the kitchen table at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. He described what Raymond Osei had told him about presence, and what Gloria had told him about practice, and what the weighted doll in the parenting class had taught him about the mechanics of holding something small and fragile and entirely dependent. And then Gerald asked him the question they had practiced, the one that Catherine Marsh had insisted be the pivot point of his testimony. "Mr. Mercer, what do you want from this hearing?" Adrian looked at Judge Denton. "I want the chance to be in my son's life," he said. "Not immediately, and not on my terms, and not in a way that prioritizes my need to feel like a father over his need to feel safe." He paused. "I want whatever access this court believes serves Noah. And I want the opportunity to earn more than that over time." He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at the judge. "I know what the record says about who I was. I'm not asking this court to ignore that record. I'm asking it to hold space for the possibility that the record isn't finished yet." Gerald sat down. Patricia Wren cross-examined him for 30 minutes, and she was methodical and unsparing, and Adrian answered everything she asked him without deflection, without redirecting to his progress or his therapy or the 2 months of work. Just the question that was asked, answered honestly, even when honesty was not flattering. She asked him about specific entries in the log. He confirmed them. She asked him about the text messages. He confirmed them. She asked him whether, prior to this proceeding, he had ever considered that his wife might be struggling. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew," he said. Wren looked at him. "I knew she was struggling," he said. "I told myself it was postpartum adjustment. I told myself she was managing. I told myself I used a lot of words that let me not do anything." He looked at the courtroom. "The truth is I knew, and I chose not to engage with it because engaging with it would have required something from me that I didn't want to give." Wren studied him for a moment. "What would it have required?" she asked. "Being there," he said. "Being present in a way that didn't have an exit." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "No further questions," and sat down. Judge Denton called a recess of 45 minutes. Adrian sat in a conference room with Gerald and Catherine and didn't speak for most of it. Catherine had brought coffee, and he held the cup without drinking it and stared at the table. "You did well," Gerald said. "Don't," Adrian said. Gerald looked at him. "I don't want to hear that right now," Adrian said. Not harshly, just plainly. "I'll know in an hour whether I did well enough." Gerald nodded. He understood. Catherine was looking at the window. "Whatever she decides today," she said, "is not the end of this. Custody arrangements are living documents. They change as circumstances change." She looked at Adrian. "The work you've done in the last 8 weeks is not for this hearing. This hearing is one moment. The work is for the next year, the year after that." Adrian set down the coffee cup. "I know," he said. They walked back into the courtroom when the bailiff called them. Judge Denton took her seat and looked at the room for a moment before she spoke, the way she had at the contempt hearing, as if she was making sure the room understood that what came next was not procedural but human and required to be received that way. "I've presided over a great many custody hearings," she said. "They vary considerably in what they ask of this court. Some are straightforward, some are not." She set her notes on the bench and looked at them briefly. "This one is not straightforward." She addressed the contempt violation first, formally incorporating her finding from the earlier hearing into the record of this proceeding. Adrian sat still. She addressed the existing evidence. She did not summarize it. It was in the record. But she characterized it, and her characterization was measured and exact. The documentation submitted by the petitioner establishes, clearly and without significant factual dispute, a pattern of physical and emotional absence by the respondent during the first 4 months of the child's life. The log maintained by Ms. Mercer, which the respondent has not contested, reflects a level of isolation and unsupported caregiving that this court takes seriously. She paused. "I also take seriously the evidence submitted by the respondent regarding his conduct over the past 8 weeks. She looked at Adrian directly. "I want to be clear about what that evidence shows and what it does not show. It shows a man who has begun to do the work. It does not show a man who has completed it. Those are different things, and courts that confuse them do children a disservice." The room was still. "Here is what this court is going to do," Judge Denton said. She granted primary physical custody to Naomi. She granted Adrian supervised visitation, 2 sessions per week, 2 hours each, at a court-designated family center with a child development specialist present. She ordered that the sessions be evaluated at 90 days and adjusted based on the specialist's assessment of Noah's comfort and Adrian's engagement. She ordered that Adrian continue therapy with Dr. Osei for a minimum of 6 months and submit monthly progress reports to the court. She ordered that he complete the parenting course and submit the completion certificate within 30 days. She ordered child support at a figure that Gerald had anticipated, and that was fair. She ordered a full custody review at 6 months. At the 6-month review, she said, this court will consider expanding contact based on demonstrated progress. What I'm looking for at that review is not another filing of evidence about who Mr. Mercer was in the past. I will be looking for evidence, direct, observable evidence, reported by the family center specialist, of who he is becoming in the present. She looked at both tables. I want to say something further, and I want both parties to hear it clearly. She set down her pen. This child is 5.5 months old. He has his whole life ahead of him, and the structure of that life will be shaped significantly by how the 2 adults in this room choose to conduct themselves going forward, not toward each other, but toward him. She looked at Naomi. Ms. Mercer, this court recognizes the courage and the clarity it required to do what you did. It also asks you to consider, as you move forward, that Noah's relationship with his father, whatever that relationship becomes, is separate from your relationship with Mr. Mercer, and that the former need not be defined by the latter. She looked at Adrian. Mr. Mercer, you have been given a very narrow opening, narrower than you would like, and appropriately so. She held his gaze. What you do with it is entirely up to you. This court will be watching. She lifted her gavel. We are adjourned. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Gerald shook Adrian's hand and said things that Adrian heard but didn't process, because his attention had gone somewhere else. He was watching the courtroom door. Naomi came out with Patricia Wren and her assistant, and they stopped a few feet into the hallway, speaking quietly, and then Wren and the assistant moved toward the elevator and Naomi stayed. She was putting Noah into a carrier. a soft front-facing carrier that Noah was settled into with the comfort of a baby who had been carried this way many times. His head rested against her chest, his eyes wide and moving, taking in the hallway with the undiscriminating interest of an infant for whom everything is equally new. Adrian stood 12 feet away. Gerald was still speaking to him. He stopped when he realized Adrian's attention had left the conversation. Adrian looked at Noah. Noah's eyes moved across the hallway in that wandering, unfocused way, cataloging light and movement and shape without assigning meaning. Then, and Adrian was never entirely sure afterward whether it was real or whether he constructed it from need, his son's eyes passed across his face and paused. Not recognition, too young for recognition in any certain sense, but a pause. The particular stillness of an infant eye that has landed on something and held it for a second before moving on. It lasted maybe 1 second. Naomi looked up and saw Adrian looking. Her expression didn't change significantly. Not warm, not cold, just present. The face of a woman who had decided to be in a difficult moment without flinching from it. She settled the carrier strap with one hand. Adrian took 2 steps toward her and stopped. "I won't ask for more than what the judge gave me," he said. "I want you to know that." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I'm going to use what she gave me," he said. "Every session. I won't miss one." "Good," she said. He looked at Noah. Noah was looking at the ceiling light fixture now, entirely occupied by it. Adrian looked at the side of his son's face, the curve of his cheek, the small, perfect ear, the way his mouth moved slightly as his eyes tracked the light. "What's his middle name?" Adrian asked. His voice was quiet. Naomi looked at him for a moment. "James," she said. "Noah James, after my grandfather." He nodded. He held that. "He likes being sung to," Naomi said. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less defended. The voice of a person who had made a choice to offer a small thing because the small thing served the child. "In the morning, before he's fully awake, he calms down faster if you sing something low." She paused. "Doesn't matter what, just low." Adrian looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She adjusted the carrier strap again, a small, unconscious gesture. "The first visitation is Wednesday," she said. "I'll bring him." "Okay," he said. She walked to the elevator. Patricia Wren's assistant held the door. Naomi stepped in and turned around and stood there, and for one last moment, just before the doors closed, she looked at Adrian across the hallway, and her face held something that was not forgiveness, and not hatred, and not hope. In any simple sense, it was the look of a person who had survived something and was still standing and had decided to keep standing regardless of how it felt. The elevator doors closed. Adrian stood in the hallway and breathed. He drove home alone. He sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on more than the small light above the stove, the one Naomi had always left on at night, and he sat with everything that had happened in the past 8 weeks and everything that had happened in the years before that, and he let himself feel the full weight of it without negotiating with it or reframing it or looking for the angle. He had lost his marriage. That was permanent. There was no version of the future in which he and Naomi rebuilt what they'd had, not because she was unwilling, but because what they'd had wasn't worth rebuilding. What they'd had was an arrangement that had served certain purposes and had failed, comprehensively, to be a genuine partnership. He understood this now with the clarity of a man who had been forced to look directly at something he'd been skilled at looking around. He had lost 2 months of Noah's life, on top of the 4 months before that. 6 months in which his son had grown and changed and smiled for the first time and cried through the night and developed preferences and fears and responses that Adrian knew nothing about. He could not get those months back. He knew this, and it sat in him like something that would always sit there, specific and permanent. A scar that would not be remarkable over time, but would always be there. He had lost Vanessa, which was the loss he'd expected to grieve more than he did. He grieved it less because the relationship, seen now from the other side of what it had cost, had never been the thing he'd told himself it was. It had been a way of being seen by someone without being known, which is a particular human craving and a particularly useless one, because being seen without being known is just performance, and he'd had enough of that. He sat with all of it. Then he took out the composition notebook and opened to a blank page and wrote, at the top, Wednesday. And below that he wrote, low voice, singing, doesn't matter what, just low. He sat for a moment looking at what he'd written. Then he wrote Noah's full name for the first time, Noah James Mercer. He looked at it, wrote it again, not for any practical reason, because the name was real, and his son was real, and the keeping of the name, written in his own hand in his own notebook, was the smallest possible act of fatherhood. And it was what he had available right now, and he was going to take it. The first visitation happened on a Wednesday morning at a family center in Eastlake that smelled of industrial cleaner and cheerful paint, and had a room with soft floor mats and age-appropriate toys, and a large window through which the specialist, a calm woman named Teresa, could observe and take notes. Naomi brought Noah in at 10 o'clock. She was dressed simply, no jewelry, her hair down. She carried Noah on her hip and checked in with Teresa at the door, and then she set Noah down on the mat and straightened up and looked at Adrian, who had arrived 20 minutes early and was sitting on one of the low chairs at the edge of the mat. "Okay," she said. That was all. She went to the observation area. Adrian looked at Noah. Noah was sitting, he could sit now with some support from the mat, and he was looking at a plastic block on the floor in front of him with the focused, assessing attention of a 6-month-old encountering an object. He was wearing a green outfit with a small collar. His hair had come in more than in the photos, dark and slightly unruly. He was bigger than Adrian had expected and smaller than he'd hoped, and entirely himself, a whole specific person, whoever that person was going to turn out to be. Adrian got down off the chair and sat on the mat. Noah looked up at the movement. His eyes found Adrian, and he looked at him with the direct, slightly solemn attention that babies give to unfamiliar faces. Not afraid, not welcoming, just assessing, just looking. Adrian looked back. "Hi," he said. Low voice, exactly the register he'd practiced. Noah blinked, looked at the block, looked back at Adrian. Adrian picked up the block very slowly and held it out, not pushing it at Noah, just making it available, letting Noah set the pace. Noah looked at the block, then at Adrian, then at the block again. Then he reached out one hand, a slow, uncertain, reaching motion, and wrapped his fingers around the block. Their fingers touched for a second, Adrian's and Noah's, around the sides of the same plastic block. And Adrian's chest did something it had not done in as long as he could remember, which was simply open. He let Noah take the block. Noah held it and mouthed the edge of it and dropped it and looked at it on the mat and then looked at Adrian again. Teresa wrote something in her notepad behind the glass. Adrian did not sing that day. He wasn't ready for that yet. He sat on the mat and he made the sounds that adults make around infants, low, rhythmic, present, and he offered toys and withdrew them and followed Noah's cues the way Gloria had taught him, and he stayed there for the full 2 hours without once looking at the clock, which he had been worried about, had genuinely not known whether he could do, and it turned out that he could, because the 2 hours went by the way time goes when a person is actually in the room they're in. When Naomi came to collect Noah at noon, she paused in the doorway of the mat room and watched for a moment. Adrian was on his knees on the mat, making a low sound that wasn't quite a song but was close to one, and Noah was on his back looking up at the ceiling with an expression of drowsy contentment. Naomi looked at this. Then she came in and picked Noah up, and he went to her immediately with the comfort of complete familiarity settled against her shoulder, and she looked at Adrian. "Same time Thursday?" she said. "Yes," he said. She left. He sat on the mat for a few minutes after they went. Teresa appeared in the doorway and said, "Good session," in a practical, professional way that told him nothing about her notes, and everything about the fact that the session had been unremarkable in the best possible sense. No distress, no wrong moves, nothing that would require a difficult entry in the report. He thanked her and left. In the car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. He was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of sitting on a mat for 2 hours with an infant. It was the exhaustion of having been genuinely present for 2 hours, which was different from his ordinary exhaustion, which had always been the exhaustion of performance. He started the car and drove back through the city and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like someone who was going somewhere worth going to. The 6-month review came in February. Teresa submitted her report 3 days before the hearing. Gerald read it to Adrian over the phone. In the careful, measured way Gerald read things that mattered, and the report said that the respondent had attended all 24 scheduled visitation sessions, had missed none, had arrived on time for all of them. It said that the infant's comfort with the respondent had increased progressively and measurably across the 6 months, and that by the 16th session, the infant was demonstrating clear recognition responses, reaching toward the respondent, vocalizing in his presence, settling when held by him without significant distress. It said that the respondent demonstrated consistent, attentive, child-centered engagement across all observed sessions, and that there was no observed behavior that raised any concern. It concluded with a recommendation for expanded unsupervised contact. Gerald read this last sentence twice. When he was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Adrian," he said. "Yeah," Adrian said. "I've been doing this for 23 years, Gerald said, and his voice had in it something that was not quite professional and was not quite personal, but was the specific thing that happens when a man who has seen too much is surprised in a way he didn't expect to be. I don't see this often." "The recommendation?" "The trajectory," Gerald said. "Most people don't change this much this fast. Most people run out of steam by month 3. A pause. "Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it." "I will," Adrian said. At the February review, Judge Denton granted unsupervised visitation, 1 full day per week, increasing to 2 days at the 9-month mark pending review, and a shared holiday schedule going forward. She formally acknowledged Teresa's report and noted its findings. She looked at both tables. "We will continue to review," she said, "but I want to say something for the record." She looked at Adrian. "The court has observed, through the submitted reports and the documentation before me, a degree of genuine effort and genuine change that is not always present in proceedings like this one." She paused. "I do not say this to minimize what came before it. I say it because courts exist not only to hold people accountable for past conduct, but to create the conditions in which different conduct becomes possible." She looked at Naomi. "Ms. Mercer, your cooperation throughout this process has been evident and has served your son." She looked back at the room. "We are adjourned." The agreement that Adrian and Naomi built over the following year was not warm. It was not a friendship, not a reconciliation, not the kind of amicable divorce that people describe as healthy in self-congratulatory terms. It was something more unglamorous and more real than that. A working arrangement between two people who had been through something that had marked both of them, conducted in grocery store parking lots and brief front door exchanges, and the occasional necessary text message about schedules and pediatrician appointments and the specific logistics of a small person who existed in 2 places. Naomi moved back to Seattle when Noah was 11 months old. She found an apartment in Fremont, 15 minutes from Adrian's house, which was a practical decision that required something of her that she never described to him and that he never asked about, because there are things that a person does for their child that they are owed the privacy of. When Noah was 14 months old, he took his first steps in Adrian's kitchen. Adrian called Naomi immediately. His voice on the phone was unguarded in a way that surprised her. She could hear it, the simple, unperformed joy of a man who had been there for something and knew it. She said, "Oh, that's good. That's good, Adrian." And she meant it, and he could hear that she meant it, and they stayed on the phone for maybe 30 seconds, saying very little before hanging up, and that 30 seconds was its own quiet kind of progress. When Noah was 2, Naomi met someone, a man named Daniel, who taught architecture at the university and had a patient, steady manner and an easy relationship with children. She told Adrian about him in the straightforward way she now told him things that were relevant to Noah's life. Not asking permission, not softening the news, just informing. Adrian said, "Okay, is he good to Noah?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." And that was that. He went home after that conversation and sat in the kitchen for a while and felt things that he didn't try to name, because they were complicated and not all of them were bad, and he understood enough about himself by now to know that the complicated ones needed to be sat with rather than solved. He had started dating, cautiously, at the year mark. Nothing serious, mostly evenings that reminded him of what he valued now and what he didn't, and the gap between those two things had widened considerably over the past 18 months. He found that he valued things he had not previously known how to value: reliability, attentiveness, the willingness to be ordinary with someone rather than interesting to them. He was less immediately compelling than he had been, he thought, and more worth knowing, and he was at peace with that trade. On a Sunday afternoon when Noah was 3 years old, Adrian pushed him on the wooden playset in the backyard. The same playset he'd had installed before Noah was born, and that had sat unused for the terrible months, and that had become, over the past 2 years, exactly what it had been built to be. Noah was shouting for him to go higher, his voice carrying the specific pitch of a small child who has discovered that velocity is the best thing in the world. Adrian pushed, and Noah went up and came back and went up again. And his laugh was an open, unself-conscious thing that cleared the yard. Adrian was laughing too, without deciding to, without performing it for anyone. Just laughing because his son was laughing, and he was there, and these things were happening at the same time. He knew his son's middle name, he knew the name of his pediatrician, and the reason Noah had been afraid of the bathtub drain for 3 weeks at 18 months, and the exact low sound Noah made right before he fell asleep. He knew that Noah's favorite book was the one about the truck, not the one about the rabbit, regardless of how many times people gave them the rabbit one. He knew that Noah ate his food in a specific order, all the same colored things first, and that this was both peculiar and absolute. He knew that when Noah was overwhelmed, the thing that helped was not talking but sitting nearby, just being a body in the room, which was a thing that Raymond Osei had once said to Adrian in a session, and that had turned out to apply, in its own way, to his son. He knew his son. Not perfectly. Imperfectly, incompletely, in the ongoing and unfinished way that people know the people they love, which is always partial and always in progress and is exactly enough. Noah came back on the swing and reached his arms out and said, "Hold me, Daddy," which was the thing he said when he wanted to be caught, wanted to stop being in motion and be held instead. Adrian caught him, mid-swing, lifted him up, settled his weight against his chest. Noah put both small hands on Adrian's face. He did this sometimes, Noah, held someone's face in his hands the way children do when they are not yet sure where the boundaries of themselves end and the rest of the world begins. He pressed his palms against Adrian's jaw and looked at him with the direct, solemn examination of a 3-year-old who was thinking about something he didn't yet have the words for. Adrian held still, let himself be looked at. "You're here," Noah said. It was not a question. It was just the observation of a child who was old enough to know that people were sometimes there and sometimes not, who had built his small experience of the world around that variable, and who was naming the current state of things with the precision of someone for whom it still mattered enough to name. "Yes," Adrian said. "Okay," Noah said. He squirmed to get down. He had been held, and that was enough, and now there was more yard to investigate. He ran toward the fence and crouched next to something in the grass, something small and apparently fascinating, and Adrian watched him and didn't move. He stood in the backyard in the Sunday afternoon light and breathed. He had not won this. That was the thing he had finally understood, and understanding it had taken everything he had, every session with Raymond, every Tuesday night in the parenting circle, every 2-hour supervised visit in a room that smelled of industrial paint. Every morning he had gotten up and gone forward without a guarantee that forward was going to be enough. He had not won. He had not reclaimed what he'd lost, had not reversed the damage or erased the record or negotiated his way back to some prior state. The marriage was gone. The months were gone. The version of himself that he'd spent 50 years constructing, the untouchable, self-sufficient, always winning version, was gone, and he did not miss it the way he'd expected to. What he had instead was a 3-year-old crouched in the grass in the particular concentration of someone who has found a bug or a rock or a leaf of unusual interest, and the capacity to stand in the same yard and watch him, and the knowledge, not the hope, the knowledge, that he would be here Thursday and Sunday after that and the one after that. That was what it was. That was what it cost. That was what it was worth. Noah looked up from whatever he'd found in the grass and held it out across the yard. "Daddy, look!" Adrian walked toward his son.